Somewhere in America right now, someone got away with murder. That's not dramatic exaggeration. It's the actual math. Right now, statistically, roughly half of the people who have killed someone are walking around free, unidentified, unsuspected, living completely ordinary lives. And the reason why has less to do with clever killers than you'd expect, and a lot more to do with something almost nobody talks about. Back in 1962, American police solved 93 out of every 100 murders. Today, that number sits closer to 50. Somewhere in the space of 60 years, catching a killer went from something police almost always did to something closer to a coin flip. Researchers even have a name for this drop. They call it the Great Decline. And here's the strange part. After 60 years of studying it, there still isn't one clean answer for why it happened. But there are real clues buried in the data. In the 1960s, most murders happened between people who already knew each other: a husband, a wife, a neighbor, someone from down the street. Police usually had a suspect before the investigation even properly started. Today, that's flipped. A much larger share of murders happen between total strangers, with no connection on paper and no obvious face to chase. On top of that, the number of murders where police can't even determine the basic circumstances has doubled over the last 40 years. Investigators aren't just failing to catch a suspect anymore. In a growing number of cases, they don't fully understand what even happened. There's a quieter reason too, one that rarely makes headlines. In some communities, people see everything and say nothing, not because they don't care, but because speaking up can get you killed as easily as staying silent. Detectives have a name for this too. They call it the wall of silence. It isn't corruption, and it isn't laziness. It's fear, repeated across an entire neighborhood, case after case, for years. In some of the most violence-affected areas, homicide clearance rates fall far below the national average, not because detectives care less, but because an entire community has learned, often through hard experience, that cooperating with police can carry its own price. Now picture one specific man living inside this exact gap. For over 40 years, he looked like anyone else on his street: a neighbor, a husband, a retired professional in a quiet suburban house. People waved to him in the mornings, trusted him with small favors, had absolutely no idea that decades earlier, this same man had committed at least 13 murders, 50 rapes, and well over 100 burglaries, and had simply walked away from every single one of them. Here's what made him almost impossible to catch. He wasn't careless, and he wasn't lucky. He was a former police officer, which meant he understood exactly how an investigation worked from the inside. He knew what detectives searched for at a crime scene. He knew what evidence to avoid leaving behind. For 4 decades, that knowledge worked like armor. The frustrating part is that police actually had his DNA the entire time. It sat in evidence storage for years, completely useless, because there was nothing to compare it against. No name attached to it, no face, just a genetic fingerprint with nowhere to point. One retired detective who worked the case later summed it up perfectly. They had his DNA for years, they just didn't have the science yet to actually see him. So how did a man like this finally get caught after 40 years of silence? Not through a confession, not through some careless slip-up at a crime scene. He was undone by a person who had never met him, never heard of him, and had no idea he even existed. A distant cousin of his, somewhere out there, decided to send off a simple DNA test purely out of curiosity about their own family history. They had absolutely no idea what that one small decision was about to set in motion. Investigators took DNA collected decades earlier from the original crime scenes and uploaded it to the same public genealogy database. It didn't match him directly. It matched a distant relative, maybe a third or fourth cousin. From that single thread, investigators built an entire family tree by hand, branch by branch, generation by generation, slowly narrowing an enormous web of relatives down until only one name was left standing. Once they had that name, they didn't even need to confront him. They simply watched him for a while, then collected something he had already thrown away on his own, a discarded item pulled straight from his own trash. They tested it. It matched. 40 years of silence ended, quietly, over something as ordinary as garbage and one stranger's idle curiosity about where their family came from. What makes this bigger than a single case is that he wasn't the only notorious killer caught this way. For decades, a different killer terrorized another American city entirely. This one wanted attention. He taunted investigators directly, mailing them letters, even giving himself his own chilling nickname. For 30 years, nobody could identify him. Then, almost by accident, he handed police the answer himself. He sent them a computer disk containing a message, not realizing the disk also carried hidden data buried inside the file itself, an old deleted document with a name and a church attached to it. That single overlooked detail led investigators straight to a man named Dennis Rader. He wasn't caught by brilliant detective work. He was caught by a piece of technology he didn't understand well enough to be careful with. Two of the most notorious killers in American history. Decades apart, different cities, different methods. And yet, in both cases, the thing that finally caught them had nothing to do with a mistake made during the crime itself. It was something small, something completely outside their control, arriving years or even decades later. This case changed far more than one man's freedom. The genetic genealogy technique used to catch him has since been used to crack hundreds of other cold cases across the country, some of them frozen for 10 years, 20 years, even 50. One victim, a child murdered back in 1957, finally had his real identity returned to him 65 years after his death. A door that had stayed shut for generations is now open in a way it never was before. But there's an uncomfortable truth sitting underneath all of this progress. That door only swings open if someone, somewhere, happens to take a DNA test purely out of personal curiosity, or if a killer eventually makes one small, forgettable mistake decades after the fact. Without that, the silence simply holds. Think back to that number from the very start of this video. Half of all murders in America, right now, unsolved. Somewhere behind that statistic is another version of the same story you just heard, another ordinary-looking neighbor, another taunting letter nobody's connected yet, another cousin who hasn't taken a DNA test out of curiosity, not yet anyway. And that really is why it's so easy to get away with murder. It was never really about how clever a killer is, or how hard police are willing to work. Solving a case has always quietly depended on someone else's decision, someone who has no idea they're holding the one piece an entire investigation was missing, a distant cousin, an old disk. Until that decision finally gets made, the truth just sits there, patiently, waiting to be found.